The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Good morning, Lysandra and John.
Good morning. Good to be back.
Today we're going to be talking about carbon offsets. How are we feeling about today's episode?
I feel excited and I feel there's pressure because we want to do this in 20 minutes. So that's my take. John, how about you?
I agree with that. It's something when we're moving into these areas, I think I want to put an advisory up about language. Not that we're going to use bad language, but the language can get crossed, confusing, what various people use. And so I think we've got to try and be quite careful about when we're describing things, saying what they are, because it's very easy in different people from different backgrounds in different jurisdictions might have a slightly different take on some of the words that we use.
Yeah, I think it's a good point.
Great points. Well, you know how I like my simple questions. We're going to start off with a very simple question. What are carbon offsets?
Okay, right. What are carbon offsets? I think the easiest way of looking at carbon offsets is it's where somebody has removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They've made a removal and they can then put that up effectively to trade.
So when should we be using carbon offsets?
John, can I say what
Sure.
I find is most clients, typically the ones that we know of, are starting with carbon offsets when it's actually the last thing they should be doing. And John can explain the rationale behind
Yeah, thanks for that. I think you're right. Some people would think or believe, shall we say, some hardcore environmentalists will think that carbon offsets are a cheat. And there are various organisations. I mean, a good example of it is a few years back. I won't name the pop group or the rock band, but they issued a carbon neutral album. And all they had done was bought carbon offsets to offset the production of the album. And I think that's a marketing PR approach to it. But if we're looking at them seriously, carbon offsets are going to cost you money. And all the time that you've got options that are more cost effective than buying offsets, you should be doing that. And again, if we take a fundamental approach, what most of the organisations promoting net zero take the view is you should do everything you can to reduce your own carbon footprint and only use carbon offsets for the residual carbon that you can't remove at that time. So it's would you call it the bottom of the hierarchy or the top of the hierarchy, whichever way you look at it. It's the last thing you should be working towards. But for many people, and as I say, a good example would be something like a rock band going on tour to say, we're going to have a carbon neutral event. The easiest way of doing that, because they might have trouble in different locations doing something about it, they could buy carbon offsets up front. I think that's the way to look at it, is they're not the ideal solution. The ideal solution is not to be emitting carbon in the first place.
If just dovetailing what John's saying, the different types of offsets in the marketplace, there's renewable energy carbon offsets, there's nature-based carbon solution offsets, there's industrial carbon solution offsets, there's waste diversion and management carbon offsets, and there's energy efficiency and retrofit carbon offsets. So there's a variety of offsets that people can secure in the marketplace, and the challenge is that they're not all equal, meaning the comfort level that what you're getting is the same from different parties is not the same, and that's the challenge with the offset market.
I think we can come back to that, but I think the other thing that's just struck me is, of course, when should you get involved in carbon offsets? And we're looking at taking the view of somebody who's a big energy user and a carbon emitter, but equally there is a major business opportunity out there now in the provision of carbon offsets. And you know, if you can provide credible carbon offsets to the marketplace, then that could become a revenue stream for your company. And that could be an interesting approach if you're an organisation that could be both making offsets as well as reducing your carbon footprint yourself.
Really good point. And because we do a lot of work in the agriculture sector, that we think that sector is, well, certainly they have a history of being actively involved, but we think there will be continual opportunities in the agriculture sector for them to capitalize on providing those offsets if they're in that position.
Playing a bit of devil's advocate, I guess. We've talked about carbon regulation in a previous podcast episode, but currently there aren't many jurisdictions that practice carbon regulation, so you're basically allowed to emit as much carbon as you want. So for those jurisdictions, isn't carbon offsets better than doing absolutely nothing to offset your carbon?
Nice devil's advocate.
Yeah, then
Yes.
what happened to the simple question?
It's really interesting because arguably, one way, if you're stuck in a jurisdiction like that, it's something that you can do. You've been devil's advocate. I'm just going to be a bit perverse. If all the people in those jurisdictions start buying up the offsets, that will push the price up, and that will make people who can do something more likely to do it, perhaps.
Great point, John. So now diving into some examples of carbon offsets. What are some common examples you've seen of carbon offsets maybe be used? And Dave, I know you mentioned a bunch of different types of carbon offsets. Maybe we can get some more details on those.
Sure, and I'm sorry if I kind of raced ahead on that one. So let's just talk about, maybe I gave you, 5 different options. So renewable energy carbon offsets, that's renewable energy projects that are developed and they could be solar, hydro, wind power that are used to reducing carbon emissions. Nature-based carbon solution would be protecting and carbon sequestration with greenery. This is where a lot of agriculture may be used, where they're using plants to conserve or trees in the grasslands and things of that nature that continues to capture carbon on a continuous basis. The industrial solution, one would be, and I think we've talked about this in the past with some of the work that we've done, is carbon capture, which I think there's a lot of discussion in the marketplace now on the validity and value behind that, but that is deemed as a form of offset if it's done properly. And then waste division, it's keeping household and commercial organic waste from into production and from emitting from carbon landfills. So an example would be a biomass boiler could be used organic matter and energy and heating. And that's an example of where we're seeing agriculture start to put biomass digesters in their operation. And the last one is energy efficiency. This would be examples of distributing fuel efficient stoves, replacing incandescent lighting with LED, higher efficiency furnaces, updating envelopes and things of that nature. So those are examples that could be done. John, is there anything that you want to add to that list?
I think that's an overview. I mean, some people might argue whether some of those are genuine offsets or not, but they are part of the offset scene. But what I want to add is I've been looking at something recently under the nature-based solutions because there's some quite interest there. And the one I just talk about a little bit is mangroves. Mangroves are basically, shall we say, that they're like trees that grow on the coastline. And you've got mangroves in a number of places in the world. There are some down in the US. I don't think Canada stretches to mangroves. But what's interesting about mangroves, when I looked at this, because somebody asked me about it, mangroves, they actually are about 7 times more efficient at removing carbon than regular trees.
Wow.
Now, please take that on advisement. That's what's being reported. But they also help protect a coastline because the roots help bind it together. And they provide an ecosystem for marine life. So you've got something there that doesn't just take in carbon, but actually has quite a lot of positive environmental benefits. And there's been a number of papers that suggest that offsets like this, rather than your regular let's buy an acre of forest, might be more valuable and more interesting. And it's also interesting that apart from the US, some places where you've got mangroves, the actually local economy could benefit from the process as well. So I think at times we've got to look at them, hate the word in some ways, but we've got to look at it holistically. It's not just about, removing carbon. If that project has got other benefits, that makes it an even better, if you like, quality offset to be involved with.
Yeah, I think carbon offsets have lately also been a popular thing with big events, like we saw with COP26. They purchased carbon offsets to kind of cover that entire event. And like you mentioned, that album they purchased, I see that carbon offsets are typically now associated with a certain project or a certain event. I personally haven't seen anything with kind of like, a company purchasing carbon offsets for their regular routine, but I'm sure that exists. I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
It does, but going back to, because we did talk about COP26 in a previous podcast, and it was the UK government that decided that they would take that approach. And I was talking to a friend about it, and he said, well, the major thing they could have done was not actually had a physical conference.
Right.
Because the majority of the offset was against air travel for people coming to the conference. Now, I'm going to say I don't think you could have completely eliminated. I think there was benefit in people meeting, but did we need quite so many people at the conference? And that's a view of, shall we say, a broader view of carbon management. Do you need the event in the first place? The other approach with events is, of course, about sustainable event management, and that's a whole variety of things. But Lysandra, you're absolutely right. I think if you are going to be putting on an event and it's in a venue that you don't own or manage, then offsetting has some relevance if you want to try and show some kind of carbon neutrality.
Well, following up on that, I think we've already touched on some issues as we've had this conversation, but what are the issues of carbon offsetting?
One thing, Lysandra, that there's no single globalized carbon offset standard. And so there's a handful of registries that issue carbon credits, and they have checked by third-party verifiers. So it would be that this is the rigor and this is the issue concerned with offsets. How good are they? I think another thing I want to bring up is that it actually doesn't stop people from reducing carbon. That's the most important thing. It just gives people the permission to keep on doing it, which is not really what we need to do as we go forward. So it should just be one of the tools. It shouldn't be the only thing that organizations should be focusing or using in this effort. Those would be a couple points that I think I'd like to make. John, you got some thoughts on that?
I'm going to take a slightly more sort of technical approach, and there are a number of issues around offsets. One of the first is a thing that's referred to as additionality, and that is that the carbon reduction, in theory, must have taken place because of the offsetting program, i.e. not because somebody was going to, if somebody was going to plant a 20-acre forest anyway, trying to claim that as an offset is slightly suspect. I think the other thing is, you talked about standards and regulation is an issue. An offset should actually be sold once and then effectively retired. What there is a concern is, particularly when you're buying offsets in another jurisdiction, is there proper control on the offsets? Is somebody unscrupulously selling that offset more than once? So there's a range of issues around there. Then there's the permanence of the offset, and Dave talked about energy efficiency as being a potential offset. But where do you go? Let's say that somebody claims an offset for doing LED lighting, and I mean, I can't see why they would, but then actually switches back from LED lighting to something else. That you've then got the fact that doesn't survive and that doesn't last. And then you've got the real, I'm not going to even say it's the elephant in the room. You've got the real problem is you're trying to measure something that's abstract in real serious sense. We're always measuring carbon by proxy. If we were buying a tanker load of oil, we would know the name of the tanker, we would know where it was filled up with oil, we would know where it was on the high seas, we would know which refinery it was going to, etc., etc. We'd have a total audit trail that we could go and physically inspect. The best you can do in inspecting a carbon offset is if somebody claims that they have, and let's keep it to our notional acre of forest. You can take a trip to see the acre of forest, but then you're not really sure, is that the acre? There are issues there. And so there needs to be a degree of trust, but there needs to be systems in place. And I think Dave touched on this earlier, and you mentioned the word verified. And I gave a warning, advisory warning at the beginning about language. You know, one person's verification might be another person's just having a quick look at it. And there is a whole issue in verification. You know, is the verification, is it full verification? Is it limited verification? Is the verifier independent from the offset itself? You know, we don't want people, it should be third party. So that there is a whole lot of issues around, in simple terms, the quality of the offset, the measurement of it, and the, should we say, the singularity of it. I'm going to say that it is that offset, it's your offset, you have ownership of it, and away we've gone.
You mentioned quite a few really good points, and I think something that kind of strikes me is, are offsets in the same area as emissions? Let's say we've talked about the event or things like that. There's emissions in these certain areas. Do the carbon offsets need to be in that same area? Has that been decided?
No, I think that the view taken, and it is, I think, a reasonable one. GHGs go into the atmosphere.
Right.
And it's the whole atmosphere. Because, you know, if you imagine, if you thought the other way round, that the atmosphere was a swimming pool, it wouldn't matter where you were putting in and taking out. It would affect the swimming pool as a whole. I think that's quite fair. I think the issue with remote offsets is, again, the ones of how sure are you of the operation of them, how realistic. But it's not like looking at an offset that's round the corner from you within your own same jurisdiction. You know what rules are applying and things like that. That said, there's clearly, as I mentioned, with the benefits of something like mangroves, there could be a major social benefit in offsets being in parts of the developing world. There could be broader economic benefits, but it's not a simple area, and perhaps that's another reason why you don't rush into it.
Another question that kind of came up in my head as you were talking about it is, who controls the offset? So if I'm a company and I want to purchase an offset, am I purchasing this from, a carbon offset company? Am I able to come up with my own carbon offset and fund it and get credit for it? How does that kind of work?
Generally, you would go to a supplier of carbon offsets.
Okay.
It gets slightly suspicious if you're doing your own carbon offset, because if you're doing your own carbon offsetting, that's more about carbon accounting within your organisation, arguably, and you're not going to be necessarily trading it. I do remember going way back in this country, we have a retail chain, Body Shop, that do cosmetics, and they've always campaigned on the environment. This was before offsets were talked about. We're talking 20 odd years ago. And one of the things they realised, they've got a lot of stores, high street stores. And at that time, there was very limited renewable energy available. So their approach was they invested in wind farms up to the same capacity as their shops. And so their argument, their public argument was, they didn't use the language offsetting as such, but basically we have compensated for the emissions that our high street stores make by being a provider of renewable electricity. Now, this is where the sting in the tail comes. By them doing that, anybody who bought that renewable electricity couldn't claim the carbon on it, because the Body Shop had already taken that to say they were claiming it against their operation.
And John, maybe we should talk about the logistics, because you're right. You go and you speak to a firm to arrange or to get these carbon offsets, but you've You also noted, and I know of organizations here in Canada that actually will invest in a technology and or a development, whether it's renewable or whatever. And because of that investment, they will be deemed the offset for that type of work. Is that pretty typical or
No,
is
I don't think that necessarily is. And again, if they're claiming that, then that offset's not tradable.
right?
This is the thing you have to remember, that an offset can only have one unique owner.
Right. So that's me
Well,
bad.
well, not quite, because credits typically exist within trading programs,
Yes.
and that is intriguing because the word offset's not used within those programs. I mean,
Right.
we have the European emissions trading scheme. We've now got the UK emissions trading scheme, and within that, people will trade credits effectively or trade emissions. They don't refer to that necessarily as an offset, but it will be a credit or a tradable certificate.
So
They are actually, sorry, Dave, they are actually probably more accountable and obvious because they go through a central registry within that program.
it might
But
more rigor. Is that basically
we don't have a set, as far as I know, and I like to think I know a little bit about this area, we don't have a singular central registry for carbon offsetting.
Right. So it might have not the same rigor as the credit piece. Yeah.
Well, we've touched on quite a few different points on carbon offsets. What is the biggest takeaway from this episode for our listeners?
So I'll chime in. It's what I said at the beginning. It's a tool, and it shouldn't be used as the only option or tool that customers should be using to mitigate their carbon emissions. And they're not all equal, as we've alluded to. So you should really do some homework. If you're really interested in this, you should do some homework and make sure if you're going down that route, that you're going to get something that actually is real and has some rigor behind it. But I stress this should not be the first thing and the only thing that people should do. That would be my biggest takeaway or comment that I'd want to make in the marketplace, because I see people do this all the time with offsets.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dave. I think, putting what you said just a slightly different way, carbon offsets are one tool in the toolbox, and there is a place for them, because if we quote are racing to net zero, we're going to need some, we can't eliminate all the emissions we want to quickly. So that's one thing. They are one tool in the toolbox, and like all tools, they should be used for the right job at the right time. And the second one is the classic piece of Latin, caveat emptor, which is buyer beware. And you're absolutely right. You need a lot of due diligence if you're going to buy carbon offsets. Now, if that's going to be something you're doing repeatedly, that the investment, if you like, in due diligence will be fine, because you will set yourself up with an agent or somewhere where you know you're getting what you want, and that will be fine. But not every ton that you buy as an offset is equal.
And I think this is so new, certainly in North America. So maybe a lot of people aren't aware of the differences. So, and they, lack of knowledge. But as people get more and more sophisticated and knowledgeable about this, people will be checking in when customers or clients say that they have offsets. So they'll actually do due diligence and see if that's true. So I think there'll have to be more effort by clients to make sure that they are real for that reason.
Yeah.
Leaving us with some heavy takeaways. Thank you, Dave and John, for this episode.
Been a pleasure. By the way, are we carbon offsetting this episode?
Hey, I mean, we're mostly from home, so.
Are we? There's no travel involved.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.